Welcome again, Joe. You're making a bit of a habit of this.
Yes,
every few weeks. Lovely to have you here. Now, planning corruption in the heart of Bristol is how I'm sort of headlined it. You and I have been talking about, we already have had a bit of a chat about this St Mary Le Port planning development in the city centre. And before we look at the specific site, why would you, given all the things you could write about, why would you write about planning?
Well, I got drawn into this subject and really through looking at it was the start of 2022 and becoming aware of what the proposals that were planned for this site at the historic heart of Bristol, and just looking at that, basically 3 very large office blocks. Made me feel that something was amiss.
Well, yeah, it's important to mention, isn't it? You've also got the old church tower, dwarfed by these, which is
it's St Mary Le Port. So if we think about Bristol, this bit of land is where Bristol began over 1,000 years ago. It's the ancient crossroads that were first set out in late Saxon times.
So if you come over the Avon in central Bristol, just as, by the way, the bridge you're no longer allowed to drive over, you can only come in cycles, and I'm not even sure if taxis are allowed over there anymore. Yeah. But if you come over onto the north side, there's a little rise, and on the right-hand side is the entrance to the city's big park, really, Castle Park, alongside the edge of the river. And at the very top there's a crossroads. 3 of the quarters of the crossroads are still built on, but there's one which is a bit back off the road, and it was built on, I think, after World War II when the whole area was redeveloped. So can you just take us a little bit through the history? I mean, you can go back as far as you want, actually.
Yeah. Well, that bridge you're talking about going over there, that is pretty much the site of the original bridge that gives Bristol its name. So that the Saxon name was Brigstow, meaning the place by the bridge. It was that crossing of the Avon. That's why the settlement began there on that bit of high ground, originally surrounded by a loop of the River Frome, a tributary of the Avon, which was then diverted in the 13th century. But that was where Bristol started.
The place. No, this is the place.
The place.
The place by the bridge is Bristol. This is the place.
And that area, Castle Park, you're saying, this site we're talking about is on the western edge of Castle Park. And Castle Park only exists because that very densely built-up area was all destroyed in 1940 in the Bristol Blitz.
But there was no castle there at that point, was there?
No, that had gone by the 17th century.
So this is Civil War.
But that area was the shopping and entertainment centre of Bristol, but made up of medieval streets, half timbered buildings, but also cinemas, pubs, and pretty much the only living there.
I mean, after the war, pretty much the only thing remaining after 1940 Blitz, it was St Mary Le Port Church. And I remember being told by one of the Polish visitors to Bristol working here, saying, "Well, this is so important that this is like it is, because it's a permanent reminder of World War II. It's a permanent reminder to everyone in the city what happened." And he's right. You look at this old burnt-out church, and of course the youngsters are saying, "Well, why is it like that?" And Mum and Dad will start talking about
and the tower remains. It's a 15th century church there, but that was the origins of Bristol are sort of shrouded in a certain amount of mystery. Historians argue over it, but it's likely that was the site of the first church in Bristol. And so following the Bristol Blitz, the tower remained, and then there was a big argument over what would happen to that part of the city after the war.
It's like you say, the place. It's the main heart of the city, and so they took a while, didn't they? Wasn't it the 60s or 70s before they actually built on it at all?
Yeah, it took a long while. So originally the traders wanted to have the shopping district built again on that site, but the city fathers, the planners, and most importantly the big retailers, the big national retailers wanted to build a new shopping area, which became Broadmead down the hill. So the whole area, it was a temporary car park, and there were lots of arguments about what would happen to it. Eventually, in the early 60s, they built these two very, very unpopular office buildings, the Norwich Union Building and the Bank of England House.
Right.
And then another building was built. Another Bank of England building was built next door in the 1970s.
It's an extraordinary place, isn't it? It's got almost like a kind of gun emplacement thing where the Bank of England trucks full of gold would go in and out. I guess they don't do that anymore. Of course they don't.
No, well, they've been. I mean, the buildings have been largely empty since the start of this century.
Yeah, a few parties have been going on in there. Some of them legal, some illegal.
There was a fire,
yes,
as there always is.
And also, another thing is the business support unit of Lloyds Bank, which is so very controversial for stealing people's farms off them and their businesses off them, very much like the HSBC scandal. But anyway, so the banks made the decision eventually, so it wasn't going to be for the people. Before, I mean, it's worth saying, isn't it, that some cities have been much more sympathetic than the 1960s planners here in Bristol were, and when rebuilding bombed cities after World War II, there were some very sympathetic rebuildings, almost like old-fashioned Tudor buildings put back almost in their place.
Well, the Germans did that a lot.
Nothing like that here. Just these great concrete.
And it's a sort of classic trope in Bristol, is that the post-war planners did more damage than the Luftwaffe, because there was this huge program of, road building, road widening, just knocking down, huge swathes of Georgian and Victorian buildings, for good reasons sometimes. The idea being that some of this was sort of crumbling unsanitary housing, and we're going to try and create a better world for people, which was them building the estates further out in the city, but it meant there was a huge loss, and a kind of, if you walk around the centre of Bristol now, there's a very jarring sense that the thing is a bit of a mess, but what remained of the old city is to the west of this site we're talking about. And you've got there a kind of dense concentration of Georgian and Victorian buildings, usually up to about 4 stories. You've got the ancient churches, because that crossroads we're talking about, the original crossroads, marked out each quarter was a different parish, and you've still got the spires and the towers of the various churches around that site. Okay,
so you've got in the 1960s these buildings are put up where they're used for a couple of decades, slowly falling into disrepair. The Bank of England, the Norwich Union, all kind of derelict and empty for decades now. And there were proposals, weren't there, to have a much more sympathetic than these towering office blocks. I saw one, I think it was from Ferguson Mann, George Ferguson's, the former mayor's architecture firm, which was much lower. I mean, they
were lower. I mean, they were controversial because they sort of bit into the park, and you then had a group forming to oppose that because they felt it was taking too much of
prime real estate. The one thing they don't want to do, of course, is just to demolish them and return it to park, because this is incredibly valuable land. Yes. There's lots and lots of spondoolies.
Yeah. And so and to get back to the original point of why talk about planning. Planning can be very dry, dry and technical, and a lot of people will kind of groan when the subject comes up. But it ties. When you've got a place like this, you're tying into the history of the place, the identity of the city. But it's also a very political subject, and it's also about power, as you say. It's money and power.
So Marvin Rees, when he's come along, didn't really have such an architectural eye as the previous mayor, and this new development, which is literally about to start, getting shovels into the ground, as they say, any time now. Marvin Rees, what about his role?
So Marvin Rees came in 2016, became mayor, and in his first State of the City address, he talked about wanting to see the skyline grow, was his words, because tall buildings mean energy and ambition. Those were his words.
Money. Actually, that's what they mean. Money. Extra floors means extra money.
It's an idea. I mean, he came in with a very, as you said, his predecessor, George Ferguson, was an architect, and and was part of there was a very big movement in the 60s and 70s, covered in a book called The Fight for Bristol, where you had all these architects and amenity groups who were seeing what the planners were doing to the city, and gathered together, and there was a big kind of fight back against that.
I remember chatting to George about a massive battle over an enormous hotel they wanted to build on the side of the Avon Gorge,
and they were doing
ruined
like,
the view of it.
They were going to concrete in part of the harbour.
That's right, fill it all in with concrete, and sell it off at every square acre or whatever.
So there were all these kind of destructive ideas, but. Marvin Rees came in 2016 with a sort of very different vision of what a city was.
You know what
an ambitious city was.
His buzzword was cranes on the horizon.
Right, and that's all we've had. There are a lot of cranes on the horizon. So part of my interest in digging into what happened around this planning application was as I went into it, was increasingly seeing how sort of pulling up the bonnet and looking at the mechanics of how this mayoral regime was trying to control planning, basically.
Well, I think that will come out as we discuss through this. But what about this company, Federated Hermes, that's put forward this application? It's not taking over the whole of the park, is it? It's something about, isn't it, about an eighth or a quarter of the park on that corner by the crossroads?
Yeah. It's essentially the same area as the three buildings that are now take up. So when Marvin Rees came in, his one of the first things he did was to begin a review of the local development plan. So all planning applications, what the planning department does is they assess them against the local development plan and the national planning policy framework. Those two things, and so. It's your policies and your local plan that shape.
Well, it should do.
So that's the idea, anyway.
Yeah, it's a tug of war between the developers and the plan.
So that's supposed to be the democratic control, because all this is a local plan is ultimately voted through by the council, full council, by the councillors. So that's what's supposed to control development. But what the person Rees got in to oversee this whole process was a woman called Nicola Beach, who was a new Labour councillor, and she had come as she took that role. She came into his cabinet in 2017, took over the role for spatial planning, and was given the task of reviewing the local plan. She had come from a PR and lobbying company called JBP, who have offices in Bristol, although they're national, and they work for developers in the planning process. So she was, at that point, she was literally working for them, trying to get a 24-story tower built on Cardiff waterfront, which was didn't happen after a big public backlash. But that's the person he got in to oversee this review of the local plan.
Well, this is about money, Joe, isn't it? Let's just be frank. Cardiff waterfront, right in the very centre of Cardiff, a massive building there. You know, the rents on something like that, the prestige involved, the money involved is enormous.
Yes. Yeah.
So it may cost them a few grand or tens of grand to get their planning permission, but at the end of the day, you've got then a massive rental income into the indefinite future from it. Yeah. That's why this is all so important.
But when you say corruption, what I've been writing about isn't about cash in brown envelopes so much, but about how you manipulate the system, how you get the right people in place. Yeah. And how you manipulate the
how
system.
You trip up the other team in the tug of war when you've got councillors and planning officers pulling in one direction, that is to say the local plan. This is what we want to do. This is what's good for local people, and the developers pulling back the other way.
Yes.
You can trip up a few people on the opposite side. You win the tug of war.
Yes. And who are the who's working for who? If you've got someone in there who's come directly from that background of working for developers in the planning system, they are they necessarily working for the public good?
No, not necessarily. No. So who are these people federated?
The first thing they did with this review of the local plan was to put a call out to developers and say, tell us which sites in the city you're interested in. Right. That was in 2017. And Federated Hermes then got in touch with the council and said, we rather like this site at St Mary Le Port. Federated Hermes are a US-based global investment manager. And they currently manage assets of over $700 billion. So they're huge. They're the biggest shareholders of BlackRock and the Vanguard Group. They work alongside the BT pension scheme, and they've done a lot of big commercial developments all over the UK in sort of the last 10 to 20 years, including huge business parks. There's one at Silverstone Park by the racetrack. There's one in Oxfordshire. They've done massive office Leeds, the biggest ever office scheme in Leeds. Big office schemes in Birmingham, Manchester.
So these
Belfast.
People are not interested really in taking old buildings, refurbishing them, that sort of thing. What they want really is to build new, build big, and to get to rake it in afterwards.
Yeah. To build on a big scale. I mean, and so there are questions around why, there's a discussion obviously going on at that early point about this site. Why is the council? It had been a difficult site to develop. There are schemes that had come through and not worked out. But the idea that you're encouraging or you're inviting a developer that builds enormous commercial schemes into the historic heart of the city seems rather odd to start with, anyway.
To be fair, what you've got there is with the Norwich Union and the Bank of England, two hideously, messy buildings. One where there's, it looks like it's almost a squatted version of Lloyd's Bank, which is very tatty buildings all around it, with one floor entrance, which is all quite clean and seems to have cleaners coming into it. But the rest of it is falling. The rest of the buildings are falling down around it. There is obviously pressure on city fathers, on everybody really, to say, well, let's just sort this site out, please. Yeah.
But it's about, and the catchphrase of Rees's mayoralty has been getting stuff done, isn't it? So, you could see this just as an example of getting stuff done. But, there's a balance to be struck between just getting stuff done and doing things that aren't going to wreck the city.
Martin, I wonder if you could chip in here. We were told, weren't we, when they went over to the mayor system, this was a coalition government Cameron-Clegg thing, the city deal. We were told that this was actually what it was about, getting things done, because there was too much political infighting going on, and they wanted things to move.
Well, that's right. I remember that era, as you probably do, and the control of the council felt it was constantly flicking between the Liberal Democrats and the Labour Party, because they didn't have all-out elections. There were elections every year in some wards. You could never be sure who would be running the city in the next year. So there was a constant bickering going on about everything. And, of course, in those circumstances, hardly anything got decided. So, of course, the idea of having a mayor was that you would have one person in charge, put the go-to person who would make the decisions, and then decisions would be made. And I think when we had the referendum to have a mayor, that of course the referendums to have and not to have a mayor had a very minimal turnout, nothing like 50% of the electorate, but the system was switched. And of course it was originally conceived by the Tory government as exactly that. It was going to actually create it's back of a fag packet stuff. What do they do in the United States? They have elected mayors. And of course, George Ferguson had been agitating this for many years. So he wanted to be a mayor, and he agitated for Bristol to have a mayor, and then he won he got what he wanted, and then he became the first mayor. And then, of course, Marvin Rees, the Labour Party, then reconfigured what it was doing and said, well, we'll have mayors, because Marvin was the candidate against George Ferguson, but he lost.
But I think, to a large extent, he managed to ride to power on the back of Jeremy Corbyn nationally, who was quite popular at the time.
You mean Marvin?
Yeah.
Well, Marvin was elected before Corbyn became the leader, and he became the mayor before Corbyn became the leader, so that wasn't the case in that sense.
He was 2015. Corbyn came in 2015, didn't he?
Yeah, it was about the same time. I can't remember the exact time.
So that's what I'm saying. I can remember thinking.
Well, what was interesting about
what you've got is you've got an actual opposition for a change with certain Miliband characters out of the way, and Corbyn suddenly. I mean, he was doing meetings around the country.
And Corbyn got people out, and he got people involved.
Yeah.
If you look at the turnout it almost doubled the turnout of people who voted in the mayoral election 2012 to 2016.
Yeah.
It's almost doubled.
Yeah.
So I think that is the Corbyn influence.
Well, and of course, what Marvin did at the time, when Corbyn when there was all the rows in the Labour Party about whether Corbyn was going to be the leader, he ostentatiously did not take sides, whereas all the Labour MPs ostentatiously opposed Corbyn. They didn't want Corbyn. Yeah. They made that absolutely clear.
I think he realised that
Marvin took the view that I'm the mayor of Bristol. That's my role. I'm not going to take sides for or against Corbyn.
He owed his job
and that was
Corbyn,
actually, I thought that was quite a smart move at the time by him. But of course, subsequently, you've got all the problems we know about having just one person and a clique around.
Well, the question is,
decisions.
getting things done for who? This is the question, Joe, isn't it, really? If you're going to we've got someone who can get things done, but who's lobbying them the hardest? The voters or private developers, private individuals and speculators?
Yes. And, I mean, it should be pointed out that there's a legal firewall between the executive of a local authority. So in Bristol, that's the mayor and his cabinet, and planning, which is supposed to be planning decisions in law are meant to be entirely separate from the executive. So again, this is what I'm looking into is how, despite that, they've tried to impose as much influence over planning as they can within that framework.
Okay, so we've got these applications coming in, various sites saying, oh, would anyone like to build in Bristol? We want cranes on our horizon.
And so what they do next to is Federated Homes buy up the buildings, the three buildings, the leaseholds. So Bristol City Council own the freehold of that land, those buildings, but Federated Homes between 2018 and 2020 buy up the three leaseholds.
Do you happen to know how long those leases are, do you?
Oh, they're about 1,000 years.
Oh, right. Okay.
So that's 999 years, something like that.
A bit of a long time. I mean, it's not almost like you may as well not bother having the freehold if you're giving leases like that.
Yeah.
Yes, I mean that must have happened in the 60s, I imagine, when these people at the Bank of England had a little bit of leverage, and Norwich Union did, saying, "Look, we will build there, but only if you give us a 1,000-year lease." What about the chit chat that was going on behind the scenes? Because I know some of that has come out through freedom of information requests and through newspaper articles and things. They were talking, weren't they, the developers and the council, quite a lot.
Well, before a planning application goes in, is submitted. There's a period of pre-application correspondence between the applicant and the planning department, where the applicant is saying, "Here's our proposal," and then the council, as the local planning authority, are giving their feedback basically, and saying this complies with our policies, this doesn't comply with our policies. But I got all the pre-application correspondence for this application, and in it you can see that for 6 months, and that's going between the planning department and also this other department in the council called City Design, who are the placemaking specialists. So they're the officers who are.
So which side of the firewall are they, though?
Well, they're not making decisions. It's the planning department who are making the decisions, but these internal specialists, they're working. They are feeding into the process. They're feeding so that they're responding to the proposals, and they are recommending to the planning department about what the response should be. So this is heritage specialists, engineering specialists, placemaking specialists.
Okay, so they're the planning side of the firewall rather than the mayor and the executive side.
Oh yes, yeah. They're not political. They're officers in the council. And you can look at this, and for 6 months they're going back and forwards, and the planning department and city design are saying this is just too big. The height, the scale, the massing of these proposals.
Yeah, a lot of these people will probably have been put in place under George Ferguson or previously, so they've been there for a while.
Oh, a lot of them have been there for years and years. Yeah, but they're saying this is going to overwhelm the old city. What remains of the old city? Yeah. They're going to tower over it. They're these sort of, it's commercial scale. So 8 and 9 stories, that's much bigger than residential. Because the floor heights are much higher. So that if you look at the pictures, hopefully you'll put some pictures up on the website.
Yeah, there's one. There's one there now, by the way.
Well, you can have
thisweek.org.uk if you want to have a look.
Have a look at them,
and you can see how these buildings dwarf the church tower.
And it's not, and what remains of the rest of the old city, and blocking views of the spires and the church towers that are there. And it's not only their size was being criticised, but it was the sort of jarring nature of their design. And they're all each block is designed in a sort of totally different way to the other one. You've got one that's a terracotta colour, which is supposed to reference Redcliffe, which is the area over the river with its sort of red brick warehouses. But it's in a totally different, conservation area.
Was a stone, wasn't it, that they would mine to make glass with, and that was quite a famous thing that happened over there.
Yes. Yeah. But it has a distinct kind of character, which is totally different from the old city. So, anyways, for all these reasons, they're saying, this is we can't recommend this for approval. We can't.
So basically you're saying to Federated Hermes, don't waste your time, this won't get through planning.
Yes.
Come up with something a bit like this or a bit like that, and you may well get it.
Yeah. But you can also see in other freedom, because there were freedom of information requests that I didn't put in, that other people had put in. This is all available at whatdotheyknow.com. And you can also see minutes from meetings that were going on, obviously fairly fraught meetings, where you've got the head of planning, Gary Collins, there, repeating that line, saying this just isn't acceptable. We're not going to be able to recommend this. And the developer, they're refusing to budge. And then you've got you can see the involvement of this guy Stephen Peacock, who I spoke about on another programme, who's now the chief executive of the council. Then he was the executive director for growth and regeneration. And he came in 2019 with a background in, he'd worked for BP, and he'd worked in mobile phone technology, and he'd worked for the Southwest Regional Development Agency. But he comes into the council in 2019. And he's getting increasingly involved. But what he'd also been doing at this time was doing he'd just undertaken a review of planning. This involved setting up regular meetings called driving development, which were with the mayor's office, in particular the head of the mayor's office and his policy advisors. And these
names for them?
Well, Kevin Slocum, the head of the mayor's office. And so these were, I think, probably monthly meetings, and you can see in this review that they've written up that it's about working out which developments going on in the city are called mayoral priorities, and how best to get them through as fast and as painlessly as possible through the system.
Now, you talked about a firewall. Surely, I mean, the mayor should be, verbally encouraging, but there's not really anything he can do behind the scenes. It's all down to the planners, isn't it?
That's what the system's supposed to be, yeah. It's supposed to be a sort of a fair and transparent system, and it's not supposed to involve the executive, the mayor. So that's going on.
So those meetings are all minuted and everything. They're official.
No. There are no minutes for those meetings. No.
What?
No, because in these freedom of information requests, the person who's made the request is asking for the minutes, and they come back with some sort of excuse that all this information is going to be made public soon, so we don't have to give you minutes. So that's going on. The application is then submitted in May 2021, and what you can see happening after that, the developer then gets in touch with Nicola Beach, who's this councillor who had worked for this PR company. And she's one of a key point of contact. So again, it's going through a political route. Even after the application's been submitted, this is not going to the planning committee. And you can see the developer responding to an article in the Bristol Post, which had a sort of very uncomplimentary headline about the proposals. And they're saying, in light of this, would it be possible to have a meeting with Marvin? She forwards that to the mayor's office, and the response that comes back is that Marvin doesn't need to see them now, but they can have a meeting with Kevin and Stephen Peacock. So that's then going on. That's summer of 2021. Nicola Beach is also having unminuted meetings with the developer. You can see that. And then at some point in August, meanwhile, Historic England have put in a very punchy objection to the application. Objections from all the kind of conservation groups and amenity groups in Bristol. But at some point that summer, they clearly decide that they've accepted the developer's not going to budge, and they're going to the officers are going to recommend it. The planning managers are going to recommend it for approval.
What about the Civic Society? They've been involved for decades in this sort of thing. Yeah,
well, so they objected quite strongly. I mean, there were things that people liked about this proposal, that particularly around the sort of ground floor, and it opens up a kind of permeability through to the park that doesn't exist at the moment. But again, it's just the scale of them, the height, the scale, the massing of these big office blocks would overwhelm the old city, is what they're saying. The Civics, when it was ultimately approved, the Civic Society did in early 2022 request a call-in to the government, because that's sort of the appeal that you can make. It's for the Secretary of State to have a look at it, which they did. I mean, I think from what I understand, that there was quite a lot of a big tussle, because the Civic Society have been much less forthright during this period of development that's been going on during Marvin Rees's regime than they were, say, back in the 70s. But they were sort of pushed by various people, I think George Ferguson being one of them, to ask the government to look at it. But ultimately, they said, no, we're going to leave this to the local planning authority to sort out.
So I mean, I'm sure there are some people looking at this, Joe, saying actually it's better that something like this happens than nothing happens, and that's the alternative, to leave this for another decade or more as this kind of monstrosity with graffiti all over it, right in the heart of the city.
Yeah, and that's what some of the councillors said when they were voting on it when it ultimately came. Yeah, I mean, I personally would say you shouldn't take that attitude with a site like this. You know, this is the most historic part of the city. It's a place with this tragic history, and that if you take a shrug your shoulders attitude, and say that basically the policies in the local development plan don't mean anything, then that's a total free-for-all.
Well, and also, it's very clear that Federated Hermes are winning, have won. What's happened is not only have they got what they wanted, but they've also changed the system in Bristol, really, by getting. There have been big changes in personnel planning, haven't there? People have been gotten out of the way and new people brought in.
Well, yes. So ultimately, I mean, I was talking about this review of planning that they'd had, and working out how to streamline the system and increase the control of the mayor's office, and that kind of came to real fruition at the end of 2022, when they just disbanded City Design, these sort of awkward group of specialists within the council, and brought them under the control of a new role, a new chief planner role, and the new chief planner came into their role in 2023. It's a woman called Simone Wilding, who is a former colleague of Stephen Peacock's, who's now the chief executive. They work together at the South West Regional Development Agency. And just to go back a second to how it was got through the committee of councillors who voted it through. I mean, it was quite a tight vote. It was 5-3. You have a cross-party committee of councillors that vote on major schemes, or particularly controversial schemes. I mean, another thing I look at in this piece is how the report was written, because you have a report that the case officer, one of the planning managers, writes that goes to the committee. And in that report, and this report was written by a chap called Peter Westbury, who'd been in Bristol's planning department a long time, but became a manager on major schemes in 2016, about 5 months after Marvin Rees came into office. He is the chair of trustees at the church that Mayor Marvin Rees attends, and his report deliberately excluded city design. So we talked about city design, these internal specialists. They until they were disbanded, were an integral part of the planning process. Their input. If you look at officer reports for schemes before this and after it, applications, you'll see city design quoted, or their views and comments outlined, summarised by the case officer, and they were just left out of this report. Which is pretty extraordinary. This is a major scheme at the historic heart of the city, and they were just excluded. In fact, there's one bit that says city design comments are summarised in key section C. You go to key section C, and there's no mention of city design there at all. So that's the kind of thing So that is deliberately misleading the councillors who voted on it, because you're not providing them with the information that you say you're providing them.
Well, one of the objections, if I can just bring this in, at the time of that decision, was the number of trees that were going to come down. And in fact, there was an enormous amount of lobbying from people in the city saying, look, no, just readjust your footprints of your buildings to fit around the existing trees. Why don't you do that? There's plenty of space there. But no, they're going to be demolishing quite a lot of trees, aren't they?
To be fair, they didn't shift one building to save some mature trees on Wine Street.
But Fee Hance, who's the Green councillor on that committee, I seem to remember she got a lot of criticism afterwards, saying, "Well, look, why on earth didn't you just stick your hand up? It would have been a 4-4 vote, and maybe they wouldn't have got this. But you've gone along with it."
Well, she's a Green. So the councillors that voted for it were the rather peculiar Conservative chair, Richard Eddy. Another Conservative councillor who actually just recently discovered is a Freemason, this isn't necessarily connected, but he actually has a podcast where he talks to fellow Freemasons. But anyway, that's just sort of
so
aside.
Who's that?
John Geeter. He's a councillor for Avonmouth and Lawrence Weston,
which is the kind of Bristol Port.
Yeah, and he's on the board of Bristol Port as well, actually.
Right, which has got the Merchant Venturers on there too, Skellet and the rest of them.
And then you had two Labour councillors. With this mayoral pressure, basically you generally get the Labour councillors will always vote for a mayoral priority scheme, even though there's supposed to be no political. Councillors are supposed to judge these applications on planning policy criteria alone. There's supposed to be no party political element.
And I've heard of cases where councillors, if they're speaking in the press and make even the smallest comment which is negative about a planning application, will get excluded from the committee, so they're not allowed to be sitting on the committee in some cases. It's very, very sensitive.
So you had two of the Labour's vote, and then you had one who abstained. And it looked to me like she really didn't like it at all, and she would like to have voted against it, but I think in the end she settled with abstaining. I can't remember her name. Anyway. I can't remember her name.
Yeah.
And then you had this Green councillor, Fee Hance, which was a surprising one, but she was saying, and this is where you have the influence of the officers in the meeting, who are basically selling their recommendation, and she's sitting there saying, I don't like this. This proposal. It's far too big, but our policies mean that we can't vote against it.
So that it was the planning officers were recommending that it was accepted, not refused.
Yes. Yeah. They're recommending the councillors to approve it, and they're saying our policies support this application.
And the council's saying this is terrible, but I'm going to vote for it.
And this is the same guy. This is Gary Collins, who's there. He's there with Peter Westbury, and you can see he looks deeply uncomfortable in the meeting, because for 6 months prior to this, until the application was submitted, he'd been in those meetings arguing with the developer, saying the exact opposite. He'd been saying that this is too big. This that is not something that we can recommend for approval.
So he's under heavy manners. From whom?
Well, I think it's quite evident that there's a lot of pressure on him from the mayor's office, from Stephen Peacock. And minutes after the vote goes through, you can see in the emails, he excitedly emails Slocum Peacock saying it's passed. And Peacock replies, "Fantastic, great work, well done." And he's Gary Collins left not that long after this, but has now turned up at Bath and North East Somerset. So he's now the interim head of planning at Bath, which is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. was a little bit concerning.
I mean, some people listening will say, what's the point of all of this? This is a slam dunk, it's finished, it's done with. Why? You've actually pretty much embarked on most of this research and writing, Joe, and the article, by the way, is linked even right now on our show page at thisweek.org.uk, after the decision's been made. I mean, what's the point of trying to revisit it? I
felt I was, I think it's important just to try and see how things are working. And I was kind of. I mean, there's nothing that's going to stop this development now,
apart from direct action,
chaining yourself to the railings. But I was sort of writing it for someone in 30 years, maybe even someone who hasn't been born, who's walking through what's left of Bristol's old city and comes across these vast, jarring office blocks and wonders what the hell's happened here. And then, they can have a look and see. But I think, but it's also there's a bigger question of, it's also the question that's been, it was in my head a long time and got me thinking. Is just the simple sense of why is this? Why are we surrounded by so many ugly buildings in this country?
Well, the other end of Castle Park, there's another massive ugly building, isn't there?
Well, you're talking about Castle Park View, which is this 26-story residential
built on the old ambulance station.
Yes, and that was the marker. That was the sort of statement that said we're building up, we're changing. Well,
it was almost like a recce, to see what we can get away with.
Yeah.
We're going to do that.
Stake in the ground.
Yes.
Yeah.
So anyway, what about Design West and who are they and how did they get on?
This is another element of seeing how the broad the wider system, the wider development system is finessed. If you're going to put it in its nicest sense. So Design West are a architecture and placemaking consultancy based on Bristol's Harbourside, and they offer a design review panel service, which all big schemes in Bristol, at the pre-application stage, the proposals go in front of a panel of sort of architects, development professionals from Design West who assess it and feed back. And this happened for Summary Report. And as I was saying, in the case officer report, they excluded the council's internal specialist, City Design. But what they did instead was lean very heavily on the feedback that had come from Design West, this external consultancy.
So they've outsourced that in a way. What they've done is they said, well, we don't like the decisions coming out of our internal civil servants. What we're going to do is we'll outsource it to some private company.
Yes. So and this is supposed. I mean, Design West call themselves an independent, placemaking service. And so then I started looking into how independent are they and who were the people on this panel who gave a really positive and fulsome response. They looked at it twice. The first one, it was very, very positive. The heights are all fine. They had a few suggestions. The second one, was all thumbs up. And so I had a look at who was on that panel. It was chaired by a guy called Charles Wilson, who chairs the whole of the Design West panel service, and he was also the chair of something called the Strategic Advisory Group for the Bristol Beacon refurbishment, which has been a big controversy in Bristol.
A massive overspend, yeah.
Yeah, the huge overspend, the council's spend going from 10 million to 84 million. But he was actually chairing this group for the Bristol Music, Trust, the charity that run the Bristol Beacon. And he was actually chairing this group for the Bristol Music Trust, who the charity that run the Bristol Beacon. And he was actually chairing this group for the Bristol Music Trust, who the charity that run the Bristol Beacon. And he was actually chairing this group for the Bristol Music Trust, who the charity that run the Bristol Beacon. that was supposed to be overseeing the build as it went along. So someone, a sort of a Bristol establishment person who's tied into who's tied into the council and what's going on with development in the city. You had other people. It was a panel of 5 that looked at the Sir Laporte proposal. You also had a director from Arup, who at that moment had just been overseeing Arup's strategic partnership with Bristol City Council, which was directly with Stephen Peacock, which basically is an arrangement that they made with Arup and a couple of other firms, where they would basically they would be the consultants for infrastructure projects in Bristol.
Right, so all this stuff finds its way into the case officer report, which is in the application itself.
Yes.
And for
going to the council
for the meeting
with
where she's going to make the decision.
And you had two of the other panel members giving this feedback. Their companies were at that point working on other projects. One of them actually in Bristol with the architects for Sir Mary Laporte, and the architects Field and Clegg Bradley Studios have very direct links with Design West. One of their founders, Peter Clegg, is on the review panel service. He was actually chair of another panel service called Creating Excellence, based in Bath, that merged with Design West. Merged to form Design West.
Let's just pull this apart a little bit, because it seems to me what's happened is there's resistance to this when it's initially put forward. Slowly but surely, the resistance is sidelined, got written out, and various friends of friends are mustered and excuses found to put their views into the case officer report. But this isn't really being done by the planning officer, is it? This is being done by the mayor's office. This is being done by the various associations of developers in the city. I mean, that's one side of things, but the other side, and in fact, I think this is where we first spoke to you about this a while ago, and that's this thing called the Friends of Castle Park, because at the other side of all of this, we've got to be thinking about the, one of the important parts of the application is, what do the local people think? What do they think?
Community engagement. Which is supposed to be central to the developer's proposal.
Now, you actually put together an article about this, didn't you? And found that the people you were writing it for didn't want to publish it.
Well, okay, so
what happened there?
Well,
because this is only a tiny part of all this.
Yeah, but this was one of the things that first got me just thinking this is odd. This is sort of a strange setup. This community group, Friends of Castle Park, kept appearing in the local press, fully supportive of the development. But it turned out that they were. This was a Facebook group, and that when these media reports said Friends of Castle Park, what they were referring to was basically one guy who'd set up this Facebook group, who lived locally, who'd moved to Bristol in 2018.
Because the thing is, it's important, I think, to understand that community engagement is part of the legal process. You have to find out, what do the local people think? This is an important thing to have in there. So, who is this guy?
Well, he'd actually been a councillor in Mid Bedfordshire, and he'd been on the planning committee of this town council, Shefford and Mid Bedfordshire. So someone who was very familiar with the planning process. He attended a meeting at the council in 2018, an area committee. So these are committees of councillors who hand out community infrastructure levy, which is funds from developers that can then go out to for infrastructure and projects around the city. and you can see in the minutes of that meeting that there was a suggestion that a Friends of group should be started for Castle Park. And Councillor Nicola Beach was at that meeting, and I think it's quite likely that she made that suggestion. And this was actually the same month that Federated Hermes bought the first leaseholds to the buildings. This is September 2018. And then the following week, this Facebook group starts up. And then once a couple of years on, once it gets into the sort of the planning application process, the Friends of Castle Park are right at the centre of the developers' so-called community engagement process. There's a couple of public meetings, online meetings. Friends of Castle Park are first on the list of all the local stakeholders that they've been talking to. But all the time, this is just one bloke, and you've got 1,000 members on this Facebook group who aren't being consulted at all, and he then submitted misleading statements to the committee around the support among this membership, which Facebook membership, because there were this group never had any meeting, real meetings. It never had an AGM, never had offices, people.
When you say there's no brown envelopes involved here, but surely he's on a gravy train here somehow.
Well, I don't know. I've got no evidence that he wants to see that site sort of developed at any cost, I think.
We also saw, didn't we, Burgess Salmon? I sent something to you a week ago or so. The Burgess Salmon, who seemed to have suddenly taken an interest in Castle Park, their staff given time off to go around picking up litter, this sort of thing.
Well, I think there's a network of people who are in the sort of loop of the Bristol establishment, and if you're in that, then these same kind of names, these same organisations pop up everywhere. But another thing with community engagement, the PR company that the developer hired to run their community engagement process was a consultancy called Marengo Communications. And another one of these links is that the director of Marengo Communications is a former colleague of Nicola Beach's, the councillor, who's been at the centre of the whole process. Yes, so that, I was writing an article for the Bristol Cable about the role of Friends of Castle Park, and that they weren't who they said they were. And it should be pointed out that two of the Labour councillors who voted to approve it in the meeting cited Friends of Castle Park, saying, because Friends of Castle Park support this application, I feel I can vote to approve it. So this is having a real world impact. It was I was writing the piece, and then the editor told me that someone had contacted a director of the paper to tell them that I'd been harassing this chap, this Friends of Castle guy, which I absolutely hadn't been. Had very few communications with him. But when I asked who was made this suggestion, the answer that came back was Nicola Beach, who seems to be at the centre of everything.
Amazing. So, in a nutshell, what's the real way that planning works in Bristol now? Because the things do seem to have changed. Personnel have been moved out, new people, new groups.
Well, the mayoral system ends in May, so we've only got three months of that. And it'll be interesting to see what happens after that. I mean, this new chief planner role is in place, and Stephen Peacock, who's been a key central figure in all this, he is still there until at least the end of this year.
So do you think, there's another subtext here, and that is, the idea is that this massive development, right for the city centre, which is so obnoxious, the idea is to get it done whilst the mayor system is still there, because it may well not get through once the mayor's out of the way and the committee system is back in place again.
Yeah, it went through, planning permission was granted in September 2022. So they've had permission for well over a year now. But it spans, the whole process really, almost spans the whole of that Marvin Rees's period as mayor. And I would recommend read. I've written two I've written a very, very long version of this, which goes into
we were joking. Actually,
detail.
It's a book, isn't it?
It was 40,000 words, so it pretty much is
just about St Mary.
So
the Port.
if you can handle that, then I recommend it's on my Substack, or there's a shorter version where I've tried to be a bit more concise. Is it fair to ask you who you think the villain of this piece is? Because it almost seems like it's not even the mayor. He's stepping back. It's people like Slocum behind the scenes who seem to be the ones who are actually doing the deal. The mayor, his role seems to be someone who goes and stands in front of microphones and says things, but he doesn't really seem to be at the heart of this at all. Well, it's hard to know. Because obviously in all the stuff that I've seen, the internal emails, the freedom of information requests, he is deliberately kept at a remove from that. But it's, those driving development meetings I was talking about, that's his head of the office, it's his policy advisors, so it's clearly that they're driving his agenda. I suppose what I'm saying, a sort of clique seems to be developing. People will know each other and who will make sure that these things are forced through, come hell or high water. Yeah, and looking at this, it's not just the political structure, but it's as I've tried to draw out, it's also this wider network of development professionals who are a sort of a sort of remote cast of people who are working out their own version of the city. Yeah, I've met some of them from Places for People who've owned this massive slice of land in St Paul's, which was demolished, and they're just sitting on it, land banking it, waiting for the value to go up, to put and maybe for the regime to change, where they can get what they want. That is to say, taller, higher buildings, higher density buildings, and this sort of thing. Anyway, Joe, just remind us of your Substack where people can check this out, download and read your book if they really want to about this, or the shorter version. Yes, joebanks.substack.com. And you've got another website too, haven't you, with some of your old advice articles and things like that on? Yeah, joe-banks.com. Well, thank you very much for coming in, and I think it's just amazing the way that, rather than just it's a similar sort of journalism as I feel, which is where you're told, no, go away, you're not going to publish this. You come back with something which is rather more powerful. Thanks, Joe.